Thank you very much. Thank you. Uh, so I extend very warm welcome to this session. We were in the midst of discussing DCE-05 yesterday, which is writing poetry. Yesterday we discussed the first block of DCE-05 that was uh, regarding themes of the poetry. Other areas which we will be discussing tomorrow and today and in the sessions that is to be held this afternoon also, I would like to inform you that perhaps you already have received information that we are having one session this afternoon that we couldn't have on 14th. So we extended the series. So that way, please note down that today afternoon from 2:15, probably from 2:15 onwards to 4:15, we'll have a session. So as I mentioned to you that the themes for the writing poetry we discussed yesterday, and other uh, areas which are to be discussed, those are structure of the poetry, imagery and symbols, and language and rhyme. So these are the issues which we will be discussing. A small recapitulatory note about the yesterday's proceedings. So I hope you remember that we discussed uh, personae, what modality the author adopts to speak to the uh, reader or the listeners or the viewer. So the author or the poet doesn't directly speak, but speaks through either one person or number of persons. Like we see in the story, there are different characters, and those characters actually create a kind of image, and then through that image is then translated into words, and those words are actually voiced, and then they are related to the external solid objects. Those are worldly objects, uh, concluding that this whole process, connects the reader or the listener or the viewer to the poet through the process that is the personae, and then there is image, then there are words, and then there are symbols. So the symbols are very important because they are the hard objects, and they actually relate the listener with the image which is created through the narrations of various people. Those various we may call them characters. Those are personae, and actually the person who is speaking de facto is the poet. Uh, if you take the example of, say, Ramayana, where Valmiki is the person who actually wanted to speak, then he takes hunter and the words, and then those hunter and the words create view, and then that was explained through the words Manishatvam Pratishtham Gama Shashwati Sama, etc. And then that exactly goes to the nest of the words, and then the arrow which was sent, which was used by the hunter to kill the birds. So it is a kind of situation which has been created, and this is what this creates a theme. Basically, it creates an environment which allows the poet to think and then create poetry, write poetry. We also discussed a very important aspect of deciding the themes, that is the nature and landscape. So the nature or the natural and the landscapes, these are very important areas which help us to select appropriate theme, because we all know that nature is very important in any theme which doesn't have some traces, some margin of nature or the landscapes will not be there for a very long time. It might be transitory, momentary creation or composition, but if it requires permanence or the poetry has to sustain, why do the English poets like Milton, Shelley, Wordsworth, Yeats, and many others have stayed over for centuries together? Why Kalidas is still very popular? What is the reason? What is the basic cause? That is because their poetry has nature and the landscapes, and that because the nature gives permanence, and also it relates to the human beings most intimately. So it is very important that there is nature and landscapes, and we have seen a lot of poets. Most of the English poets have used nature in the landscapes. There are highlands, there are plateaus, there are mountains, there are fields, there is a crop, there is sickle, what not. So similarly, if you come to the Indian poetry, we can see much more in a very intense way that nature and landscape exists very predominantly. Uh, we, and most importantly, nature teaches us to be, sensitive and sensory perception. It develops a very, very fine perception, very minute perception, very sensitive perception in one's mind. So it is a stimulating agent also. So we know that if somebody loves nature, who teaches us love? It is only nature, because it stimulates the sensory perceptions in a person, what we call in Sanskrit literature, in Sanskrit poetics, there is a very apt word for it, which is Saridai. Saridai is one who can write poetry, and Saridai is one who can enjoy poetry. Because what emanates from poetry, that is rasa, and if one is not Saridai, Saridai is one who is having sensory perception, stimulation. So it is very important. Nature is also one such agent, one such cause which allows the poet to think in different dimensions, in different directions. So nature and landscapes are very important, and these have been a very integral part of any, we can say, the legendary, any stalwart poet's creation, composition of poetry. The third point we discussed yesterday was, I feel, very, very important, that is sociological. Sociological is very important, and it is common to not only to nature and to other areas, but it is also to politics, because what happens around us, around we are human beings, we have lot many concerns, we have lot many issues, we have our day-to-day concerns, we have our family concerns, we have kinship relationships, We have a lot of problems, a lot of issues. We have a lot of politics around us. What it does, it creates conflicts, it creates issues, it creates complexities in the society, and as well in the human minds. Yet, the sociological is one such factor which is universally existing in all the societies, in all the human beings. Why I'm discussing this the sociological, because this is again a very broad area, very broad area of themes, and we have seen a lot of poetry which revolves around human lives, its concerns, its politics. Politics doesn't mean here per se the politics we understand, which is the different parties and different dalas, but it is politics about the different stances, different opinions that are expressed by different people, different groups in the society. So all those differences, all those distinctions, all those perturbing factors, all those strains in the relationships also provide us a lot of ground for writing poetry. Then we also discussed briefly the romantic. So we know what is to be romantic. There is no concrete definition about what we are romantic. Are we romantic about somebody whom we lost? Are we romantic about somebody whom we appreciate, whom we love? Are we romantic about books that we read at one point of time but we lost and are not able to read them anymore? Or we are romantic about our childhood, romantic our parents who are unfortunately not with us anymore, or what we are romantic. So a small interjection is made here that it is romantic is is a very to be a classic. That means when there is a nostalgia, there is memory, there is lamentation, there is some kind of intense journey to the past, to the history. So this also gives a lot of scope for writing poetry, because what happens with this, there are images of the past. You know, there are images of the past. Those images, help us to create for the present. So this is something very unique. This is something very typical to the poetry that we are taking this particular stance about romantic. So romantic doesn't mean only to be infatuated by something that is contemporary, but we are also nostalgic about the things that used to be at one point of time, but they do not exist anymore. We do not find our friends anymore like this. So all these, the nostalgia, the being romantic, being classic, so all this takes into the down to the memory lane, and then we have seen a lot of poetry is written about, and what one example that is also given in particular appreciable example in Hindi poetry, Wah Todti Patthar, a lady who is painted as breaking the small pebbles or putting on the road to be uh, uh, for the tarring purpose, for the metaling purpose. So that lady has been depicted where poverty, where social neglect, This, all these issues have been exploited. So basically, that refers to politics or the politics. So what I am putting through this discussion, and perhaps you might also have gone through the study material, and maybe you are also some of you might also be writing poetry. So you are very well aware, you are very well experienced, and might have definitely noted that all these issues, morality, physicality, uh, then the childhood memories, then losing some dear in certain period of time, then certain insight visions. What insight visions is something which is there in our consciousness, that comes and goes, that gets affected by somebody's visit. Then we refer that visit to some past experience like this. So all this gives ample scope for the poet to write, and I mean these could be themes for writing poetry. So now we will move to the discussion point for today. Today we are discussing the block 2 of DCE-05, that is writing poetry, and DCE-5's block 2 is about structure. Just as the yesterday's block was themes, today's block is structure. So in structure we will discuss the design, then we will discuss development of the theme, then we will discuss the climax, and we will discuss conclusion of a poem or concluding the poem. So structure is something which we have already discussed in number of units. It's a form. Structure is basically a form. That means if we compose poetry, if we write a play, if we write fiction, a short story, if we write something else, anything that we write is always in a form, FORM form. That means it has to be, it has to have a definitive shape. So poetry is also amongst that area. Poetry also is in the form, so specific form. It might be different from the short story or the play or one act play or any form of creative literature, memoir, etc. But there is a form. That means it has a structure. So the very initial stage of the structure is the design. So we give form to poetry. That means we design. So how do we design something? Suppose we have to design a road for far-flung areas. What do? We have two questions in mind: to where, and how. If it is regarding something that we want to design, two questions come immediately to our mind, and these are where and how. It, same is the case with poetry. While we sit to write poetry, then we have a question: where to begin? Where to begin? That means how to start. So where to begin? That means what, and if we have theme selected, then from which point should we begin? For example, if someone is talking about an old acquaintances in the school, the a boy and the girl were studying in a particular class in high school. They spent 3-4 years together studying. They became quite good known to each other. They shared their lunch. They shared notes. They had a lot to talk about, but then they, moved to their higher education. They settled down in different cities. They had their own lives and so forth. Suddenly they meet. Then this whole meeting scenario takes the situation to the background. But the problem is the question that I am posing here in front of you: where to begin? Should their journey of should the poetry start depicting from the present, or from the point where they separated, or from the point where they met? So this is very first question, and this has to be decided by the poet. So this question, where to begin, and second is how to begin. Second is how to begin. So how to begin? That means uh, what should be the opening remark? What should be the comment that should go into the very first line? So it is something. It is a kind of prelude to the poetry, to the creation, to the writing that one would like to write. So definitely there is inspiration to write. The problem is where to begin and how to begin. So these two questions are very important, and they set the tone of the poem. Uh, so what I'm trying to say, the beginning must be very effective, whether it is short story, it is play, or it is a poem. So it basically puts forth the author's or poet's intention. So it is something that sets the tone, and it puts the poet into scenario situation with the audience. So there is a subject, there is audience, but now the decision has to be taken. So this depends upon the tone, whether it is reflective, it is dramatic, it is ironical, it is irrelevant. Sometimes there is an irrelevant beginning, no? Then gradually it becomes relevant and very effective. But sometimes there is ineffective start. Then there is sometimes like mediative. That means some other character is brought into, then that character makes some comment, and then there is a beginning. Sometimes it is conversational, you know. Do you know, beautiful flower, how bad I felt? Something like it. So there is a conversational manner as well, and sometimes there is sometimes it's a very resentful beginning where a lot of frustration is, expressed by the poet. So particularly we know, like Wordsworth, Milton, those who are the stalwarts in the romantic poetry, they express a kind of frustration, whether it is from the life or from the society or from their beloved. So that sets the tone. So what I'm trying to say is that the question of where and how, it is determined largely by the tone. That is, what is the tone? It is rhetorical. reflective, dramatic. So that sometimes we are very dramatic in putting our views. So this is very important. In fact, it means that how this is the beginning of the or opening of the poem. So how your poem should open? It can the poet has to decide the tone uh, as to how to begin and from where to begin. Uh, Sometimes there is a very different types of openings are there. Sometimes it is very direct. So where the poet directly speaks through the persona to the audience or the readers or the listeners or the viewers. So is he or she is directly speaking, coming straight to within the poem, within the narrations, and then addressing the his or her audience. Sometimes like arms and the man I sing, who forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore. So, what is the point here? In the very beginning, arms and the man I sing. That means the arms and the man that I talk about. So, this is a very direct opening. So, it is a kind of direct opening. And sometimes, some author will also say, the pain and sufferings I have endured have never concerned the showing pity and the remorse. But so there, the poet is very direct, very blunt opening. Even in Indian English poetry, also we see a lot of, especially particularly by Shiv Kumar's poetry. He talks about the women who are on the uh, hinterlands. They are collecting the woods, cooking for the family, enduring the smoke, dust, and heat. Yet there is no remorse. There is no look back in their. There is nothing. There is no expression in their eyes. Their eyes are not moist because of their poverty, because of their condition in which they are walking, the impaled conditions. They have ambitions. They have their ambitions are growing like hills. So there is a lot of contradiction. But the poet is directly talking about their plights, their condition. So this is a very direct kind of opening. Sometimes we do not have this kind of opening, and somebody speaking in disguised manner, not directly speaking, he takes personae and then creates an image, and then that is voiced through words, and then it relates to the objects, the symbols. For example, we ate our breakfast lying on our backs because the shells were screeching overhead. I bet a rasher to a loaf of herd that Hull United would beat Halifax. So it is Wilfred Gibson's poetry, poem. So here, something which is to be told is not told directly, but it is with the group, with the personae who are talking, who are explaining what they are doing, what they are thinking, and what they're talking about, their actions, which are, which are in momentum, but then suddenly come to a screeching halt. So this image of screeching halt, the actions do not come to stand still. is a screeching halt. Only the vehicles to which the heavy brakes have been applied comes to a screeching halt. That creates an image, and that resembles to the symbol in the worldly atmosphere, where we know if something is immediately or something is abruptly stopped, then there is a screeching sound. So sometimes there are different types of beginnings: conversational beginning, casual beginning, etc. So the question is as to how to, structure the poem. So the structuring of a poem is very basically begin from the opening stance, how the poem begins. So whether it begins with a casual start or it begins with a disguised start, and the opening remarks are uh, in a disguised manner, not very direct, or if it is in the direct manner. So sometimes there is a very dramatic opening, a very classic opening. It is something where uh, the theme, the message is presented in a dramatic manner. I wander by my troth, what thou and I did till we loved. So you can see, I wonder. So it is a very dramatical tone. Uh, the poet is not saying, that what you or me were till we, met. So he is saying, I wonder what my troth, what was my, past, and what was yours, and what I did till we loved. So this is a kind of image that has been built, very dramatic image, very the image which has in action, which is in action, which is communicating through various shades. It's creating images, a series of images, and then ultimately it comes to so these are kind of different beginnings, and this particular beginning is a very dramatic beginning. Sometimes we create an image. The image is a state of a very conscious state of mind, where something has been conceived and it is pre-word stage. It is not voiced or worded yet, but the image is there in the poet's mind, which will be voiced, expressed, narrated through words, and then it will be symbolized with the concrete object in the outside world. Sometimes, we refer to a small set of few lines. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? So it's a kind of image uh, of that unknown force which has been the creator of this world. Or tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What is the forest of the night? So that would also create an image. That means there is a tiger with red eyes, and because the eyes of the tigers shines in the night, where it shines in the forest. So it means there is a very dense forest. During the night time, the tiger's eyes are not burning. In fact, they are because the tiger has very powerful eyes which can see during the night or through the darkness in the night. So it is not burning bright. It's not the forest of the night, but it is the deep, it is a very dark night in which the tiger is either moving and the tiger is looking straight, and his eyes within that darkness of the night seems as if those are two burning lights. So it is creating an image. So sometimes this is also a kind of beginning. So we can see that there are a lot of strategies, there are a lot of situations with which the poem can begin. So the question of where and how is very important because it sets the tone as to whether the poem should begin with the conversational tone, reflective tone, very passive tone, with a lot of lamentation, or with maybe in a very digressed manner, or what not. So it has to be decided by the author. And then it can be a direct beginning, disguised beginning, dramatic beginning, or can begin with setting an image. So this is very important as to how to begin because the different types of sometimes we have very ironical statement in the beginning. Sometimes it is very irrational. We do not make any sense. Sometimes it is very casual, a very casual uh, expression, a very casual idea is expressed through the beginning lines. So these are the yeah these are some of the strategies that the poet adopts to begin his or her poem. We will continue this discussion with the development of the theme. This is the beginning. So this is just the beginning of the. I mean, how to begin, from where to begin. So whether you would like to begin from the poverty of the woman working on the roadside, or with a very regretful note that society has neglected women, or the story, the poetry, the poem should begin from the wails of the child who is lying on the roadside because her mother is working on the roads and doesn't have time to feed. There are a lot of situations, a lot of angles, and then one can begin by referring to the wails of the child, or casual beginning, or from the plight of the lady who is working, who is no, not in a position to attend to her child, or simply exploiting her poverty. So this is one aspect of the structure. So that is the beginning of this is the starting of the poem. So we can say it is the every structure has a beginning, has a climax, and has conclusion or the end to it. So when we have decided the point where to begin, how to begin, so that means we have decided the set the tone, then comes the development of the theme. So the development of the theme is uh, primarily the poet has to decide, whether it has to be inspirational or or other kind of poetry. and accordingly the theme or the thematic development will be decided, whether it has to be in inspirational or in contrived, means the idea derived from various other factors or affected by other factors. Then the developmental treatment has to be decided of that particular theme or that particular area which has been chosen to write poetry upon. So for this, the poet sometimes takes uh, uh, only one central metaphor. That means there is only one, image that remains predominant, that explicate the subject of the poem, that explains the subject of the poem, and then keep on getting intense through that central metaphor till it completes its meaning. That means the only one metaphor, the only one uh, uh, only one image is which remains very predominant or remains in the center stage, and all the sub images are surrounding to that image, but and it remains predominant till the entire intent of the poet has been communicated, or the poetry has completed its meaning. Or sometimes we can have a number of images, number of metaphors that can be built around the uh, and those are all equally helpful, equally partners in poetic meaning. And this can, I mean, the skillful poet or uh, an acclaimed poet can use the language cleverly, skillfully, to either to deal with one single metaphor, that is central metaphor, to explain the intent of the poet's mind, or can take multiple images, multiple metaphors, to build up a situation which will be explaining the poetic meaning or the intention of the poet. So, sometimes we have the single metaphor as the basis of thematic development. Thematic development is the development of the theme which has been decided. We have already decided how to begin, what should be the tone. Now, the second part is how to carry it forward, take it ahead, move it. So, here, the poet is primarily uh, deciding to take the single metaphor instead of series of similes or metaphors. Similes, comparison between the two very similar objects uh, or metaphors. So the central metaphor here, it is responsible for creating various shades, situations which complement uh, in the process of making the meaning complete or making the meaning vivid or explicated to the reader, to the listener, to the viewer. Uh, in this particular style, as it is called single metaphor or poetry with a central metaphor, and the treatment of this kind of poetry deals with that single metaphor which is predominantly there, and it keeps on creating shades which explain the intent of the poet. So we will Ted Hughes one stanza may be quite important. So it says, across clearing an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business. Across clearing an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business. Only one metaphor is there, that is widening, that is deepening, that is brilliantly, concentratedly coming out of its own business. Till with a sudden, sharp, hot sting of hawks, it enters the dark hole of the head. So look who is being explained, a particular image. The window is strawless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed. So here it's very much suggestive of the poet's determination, the poet's idea, and it is a single metaphor which lends various forms, with distinct forms. So he's talking about one particular object which is projected in different forms, but that object, that phenomena, that central theme, or that uh, single metaphor, that is not diluted, that remains very predominantly there. We may explain it with thousand shades, but there is no parallel. The actor is the thought fox. The thought fox means it is basically the process, clever thinking process has been named the thought fox. So that is very agile, that is having a very sharp eyes, looking very concentratedly on something. So this single metaphor is explained in different with different dimensions, but not diluted at all. So this is one important strategy to write poetry. You stick to only one metaphor, and taking that metaphor into the central stage of the development theme, the thematic development of the poem idea, and explain it with a lot of peripheral images, but one remains very dominant. Sometimes there is a strategy adopted which is multi images, which is the diverse images are there in this particular type of poetry, type of poem. So in this type of poem, there are in the centers there are more than two characters are there. Those may be in conversational manner. Those may be expressing two different aspects of something, but both are more than two are existing. So, for example, we can say like if the poem is written about something happening at somebody's house. There is a household lady, there is a visitor, and there may be uh, there may be some other character, like if it is night time, then there may be another character like ghost, unseen, fearsome animal, or something. So Shiv Kumar gives a very good example and presents a good example in his poem. So it said, it begins at the doorstep after each day's death rattle. First, the mirror in the halfway that lets another woman in it. So there is a house, There is a character which is entering into it. Stick out her tongue at me, then the agony of journeying from one room to another, with the ghost whispering around me like the summer flies. You see, there is a clearly a ghost is there, a woman is there, a summer fly is there. So all these are interwoven. If I break into whistle, a coward's strategy to ward off evil in a wilderness, the throat flutters like the wick in an wireless lamp. Now here's very strong metaphor, which is the wireless lamp. Can there be wireless lamp? But there is lamp which is not burning and its wick has been spruned. So that means the throat has been spluttered. The terrace offers no escape either, for it exposes me to the moon's malignant eye and the stars' grin. I all ends in my bed's mummy coffin. Now, altogether, there's another metaphor: mummy coffins. Bed's mummy coffin. That means one is alone in a house. There are different images, and the poet would like to say that he is in the cold bed. Mummy's coffin. Bed's mummy coffin means one is in cold bed. That means one is without a company. So you can very well, see for yourselves how so many different metaphors have been used in creating an image and thereby putting them in words and uh, relating them to an outside symbol. Those are like mummy, coffin, bed, like. So this is another aspect of the thematic development of the poem is using an appropriate language, or we may call it appropriate use of language. Language plays an important role. All the elements in poem are infused through the language. So, how do we do it? How do the author or the poet does it? A lot of skillful crafting is done through the jugglery of words. There are words like finally, like then first, then and. Lot of and is seen in the poetry, which is not in the prose. Like there is one example which I feel is worth quoting. It is Josephine Miles' poem, which is entitled Belief. Mother said to call her if the H-bomb exploded, and I said I would, and it about did. When Louis, my brother, robbed a service station and lay cursing on the wily cement in handcuffs. Very clear. Talking about the prison, where after looting, robbing a service station, Louis has been arrested. But look how many times and has been used. And I said I would, and it about did. When Louis, my brother, robbed a service station and lay cursing on the wily cement in handcuffs. So this use of word and here is very prominent, very intelligently used. Sometimes, in situation like somebody is arrested and put on the in the prison. So if saying wily cement in handcuffs, cursing on the wily cement. Wily cement means one is forced to lay down on the floor which is not having anything to spread or anything to be, to cover the body. So one is lying without any thing, sheet to spread. So one is on the cold cement, cold floor. Uh, we also see in certain pieces where we see that there is the certain words which have been employed in the poetry to develop this central idea. Those are used in a very chronological sequence and has been used chronologically, means in number of times in a series, because that brings into the stage another, one character after the another. So this is all about the poetic strategies, which the poet develops in order to develop his or her central theme. So, what do we conclude from the discussion is that there may be a single metaphor, like in the thoughtful fox we saw. It is only about a single character, which is the thought fox, which is wavering, very clever. It's an image, it is a symbol, and then a lot of narrations, lot of dimensions have been attached to describe, explicate the character, like focusing the eyes, focused eyes, concentrated eyes, red eyes, and likewise. Then, if there are, and another example was the tiger who is walking in the middle of the jungle during the night, and his two eyes are the shining eyes. So those are imaged as burning eyes because they are able to see through the darkness also. And then there are multiple metaphors. So the multiple metaphors, like a lonely woman, the woman is alone. Yes, of course, but then there is a ghost. There is another person. There is a mummy bed. So there's a character which is alone. So all this, the loneliness of the woman brings in a lot of other characters, and all the characters play their respective roles in making the meaning complete. Then we also discussed about the chronological sequencing of the metaphors. So, which is very intelligently done through the skillful use of the language. So, in many pieces of poetry, we see that certain words like and, like then, like finally, and so forth. There are a lot of such words which comes into the poetry, but on specific occasions, in a systematic or in a very arranged uh, sequence. So that is a chronological. I mean, that is the development of the meaning. That means the successive use of the words like and, then, or finally only heightens only helps to develop the theme, make it more intense in terms of meaning. Uh, there is still another point which we would like to discuss today. That is the climax. Like short story where the conflict or the multiplicity of plots creating very complex situation, dichotomy, and situation which is very confusing. When that situation becomes very heightened and suddenly there is exposition of the reality, means the resolution of the crisis, resolution of the complex situation takes place, then there is a climax, then there is the intense, uh, then there is the intensity in the experience of the reader or the uh, listener or the viewer. So this intensity of experience refers to the climax, whether it is short story or it is poem. So it same is with the poem also, as we discussed, the heightened intensity or the intensity of the experience of the reader. So when we come to poetry, come to poem, uh, actually in poem, in poetry, we often see that there isn't much as compared to short story, which has a definitive plan, definite plot. In poetry, we do not see much, pre-planned. Uh, there is a mm, there is a discussion, there is a pondering of the theme, but then it is not much planned, much planning goes into it, and but at the same time, it is not entirely spontaneous. That means there is definitely something, but there isn't much planning, particularly with regard to the poetry. So it is a unity of impressions, lot of impressions, lot of a lot of uh, thinking, lot of experiences comes together, and all these creates a particular type of situation which create a situation where there is an eruption of expressions, that is in terms of poetry. So we also know that a poem is characterized by the poem is rather unity of impressions. There's there isn't much spontaneity, there isn't much pre-planning, so it is sudden eruption of idea. It also implies that there is a continuity of experiences. There is a poetic phenomenology. That means there is a sense of appreciation of things which continues with that. They keep on accumulating, and then their incremental stage ultimately ends where the eruption of experiences makes way to a particular type of narrations or oration. How do we characterize it? How do we say that what it is? So we can say it is the collection or the uh, unity of impressions. What is unity of impression is a very strange expression. Unity of expressions or impressions. So impressions are those which are collected gradually, and when they become very intense, then there is a uh, bubbling, there is an eruption, and when it happens, it happens in one small fraction. But all these impressions which have been gathered over a period of time, they are in sync or in synchronous situation with one another, each other. So each other synchronity means that they are in continuity, they are in hierarchy, they are in a certain set manner that they complement each other, thereby they uh, uh, complement the add meaning to the sudden eruption of experiences. So that sudden erupted experience becomes meaningful in terms of poetry. But you see, there are two types of structure in the poetry. Sometimes it is very static, sometimes it is very dynamic. That means sometimes the impression or the unity of impression, which means the series of impressions, is very static, is very stable. There is a hierarchy, there is continuity. They are not absurd. They have a meaning which keeps on developing towards one particular direction. Sometimes there are a lot of it gets branched. That means the meaning is not stable. Things are being added to it and it is being diluted. So what happens at the end when one idea, one impression gives rise to multiple meanings? There is the climax. That means the listener or the viewer or the reader, simply scratches his or her head that as to what side one should move to find out the real meaning. So if it is a static one, then there is a direct meaning. If there is no directness in the meaning, then it is a dynamic. So at the climax stage, there is if it is static, there is a singular progression, or if it is dynamic, there is a multiplicity of meaning. So in poetry, we often note down that sometimes there is a direct poetry, sometimes there is a poetry which allows the reader or the listener to decide and attach meaning to it. But of course, the central idea, which has been developed by the poet, remains very much there. So climax, if we describe the climax, what is climax? Climax is ideally a ladder, you know, and it explains the veracity of impressions, experiences. It also explains their, sequencing, and when it becomes very intense, very united, then there is an eruption in it. So the eruption also indicate the multiplicity of climaxes. That means at certain point of time it appears that this is the end of the intense meaning, but that doesn't happen. It keeps on growing, and when it reaches to another peak, then there is little more climbing. That means more adding of impressions, and then it reaches the another plane, meaning the experience or the impressions reaches the heightened stage where it again erupts and there is a very intense meaning attached to the words, to the composition. So this is the climax. The climax has been described, as a kind of ladder which is there. when one tries to, move ahead, move upwards, then one step each time, one impression each time. There's a gathering of impressions, then there's unity of impressions, then there is sudden, a resurgence of the intense expressions, that's a smaller climax, then perhaps more accumulation of further impressions, and likewise the poet reaches the highest or the most uh, typical peak, the higher peak, and then when the unity of impressions breaks down and gives multiplicity of experiences to the reader, that is the climax. So, what happens? The climax in all the poems, or rather, one can say, in all the poets, is not similar. It doesn't end in the same way. It may be sometimes very lyrical, it may be very brief, or it may be in the progression pattern. So it may be very lyrical, that means the language is playing its role, and the reader gets that rhythmic pleasure in it. Sometimes a very brief uh, uh, satisfaction to the inner soul of the reader, and sometimes it allows the reader to again ponder upon and then decide the meaning to it. So, identifying the climax in a poem is not that easy, not that stable experience. It is different to the respective persons having the degree of appreciating or having stimulating sensory agents in them. So it depends. The greater the sensory agent in a person, the greater intensity or the climax of the poem reaches to that person. So the question whether this phenomenon of a unity of expressions, unity of impressions is incremental or not, because the poetic phenomenology innately or by nature itself uh, says that there is continued continued process of accumulation of impressions, because there are a lot of impressions which adds into making a poetry. Poetry doesn't come with single experience. The poet thinks in multiple ways, looks at things differently, gathers a lot through his journey of life and relationships, through the behaviors, through the society, and from that one gathers a lot of impressions, and those impressions keep on, accumulating in the poet's mind, and when there is a there's a collection or rather a good corpus of the impressions, then all those are united. So this unity ultimately leads the poet to a point of eruption where all this become voiced. So the problem with the poetry is that it cannot be very perfectly pre-planned. Though there is a beginning, as we discussed, there is a strategy to begin the poetry, but cannot be fully pre-planned, and at the same yet not very spontaneous. I'm using the word spontaneous very consciously, because most of the people say poetry is spontaneous, and that is very correct. But if you look at the process, so if it would be entirely spontaneous, that means it will be a simple eruption having no accumulation of impressions. That means there is no role of the theme. But if Valmiki would not have been a person of the intense feeling or when person with no stimulation, with no sensory feelings, then he wouldn't have noticed the pain and the wailing, the grief of that one left ward which had lost the partner. So that means there is an idea, there is a situation, and then from that situation there is a gathering of experiences. So all this takes place in one's consciousness, one's inner mind, and then a lot of other experiences or impressions continue to add to that experience, and ultimately it erupts. So one may say that it is not well planned, too much planning is there, yet there is definitely a plan. At the same time, it is not spontaneous, but it is spontaneous. That means there is unity of impressions which erupts. So that way it erupts. So it is spontaneous, but it is not so spontaneous because it has unity of impressions. Means there were a lot of impressions in it. So poetry itself uh, is born out of a very confused state, very unclear chain of events. So that is how the poetry is very difficult to is one difficult genre to understand and clearly to spell out. Some people have explained it differently. It allows the reader or the listener, to go into it and then decide the meaning. But obviously, the central theme remains there. So we came to discuss that the structure of the poetry sometimes it is static and dynamic. There are different patterns, whether those are static, or dynamic, or progression patterns. That means sometimes there is one experience, one phenomena, or there is sometimes there are multiple phenomena. There are multiple experiences, and they keep on, building in a progression pattern. That means um, they they keep on getting refined and refined, and when it is very much, pure form, then when it is uh, when it is fully all the impressions are fully united, then the eruption takes place, which is the spontaneity of the poetry. So sometimes some people say that there's a rhythm in the poetry. It has specific intoning factors. So the meaning sometimes is derived from that music of the poetry. So like one such example, which is in the poetry of Lender: stand close around, ye staying set, with dries in one boat conveyed. O Sharon, seeing may forget that he is old and she a shade. So they are talking about a beautiful girl, but the girl is just a shade, means no more. So a person who is there, he is described as an old person. That means he can be a person who is a cartman, or who is something, who may be a boatsman or something like it. So there's a play, like There's a humor, there's a play of language which creates music, which creates music of its own. And then this music, that means that he is old and she shade. So she shade, it says that it means reduced to shade only. That means not alive anymore. So the meaning is added by the music of the poetry, the musicology of the poetry, rather, one should say. Sometimes we have heard a very popular poetry. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. This is very, very clear example of progression. Very clear example of progression, very clear example of pattern and climax. Very clear example. There is a pattern, there is a climax. There is a progression. There are three things which are very, very obvious to this piece of poetry. There are a lot of questions, there are a lot of answers. Who went up the hill? Jack and Jill. Why did they go to the hill, up the hill, to fetch a pail of water? What happened to them? Jack fell down, then broke his crown. Then what happened? Jill came. How was Jill? Tumbling after. It has a very specific progression in terms of pattern, in terms of music, in terms of play of language, in terms of climax. The climax is tumbling after. Jill, how did Jill came there? Falling, rising, falling, rising. Why it did happen? Because they needed water. So why he came falling, rising, he broke his crown. Where it happened? Up the hill. With whom it happened? Jack and Jill. So this is the best example as to how poetry should be brought to climax. Now, the interesting part is that it doesn't have a static. It has a very dynamic pattern. It has a very dynamic progression. It is getting into a very intense situation. It is giving a very concrete example of play of language, rhythm, the climax, the progression, the intensity keeps on building. Jack and Jill went up to the hill. There is very flat, very static. Then what happened? To fetch a pail of water. Another dimension added. Jack fell, dynamism, then more intensity, broke his crown. Then the real situation, meaning is becoming clear. Jill came, tumbling water. So Jack fell and Jill came, tumbling after. So he ran because to take care of Jack, who had fallen down, had broken his crown. To look after him, the Jill came, but because he was, so it is giving a different, adding another meaning. Jill came tumbling after. Why he was tumbling? He could have walked straight because he was not hurt or anything happened to him. Yet he was worried, he was anxious as to the well being of Jack. So, that is one very good example, and this illustrates very clearly the pattern of language, the pattern of progression, and also the climax, uh, rather, one can say the intensity to the poem. So, dear learners, this is something that the more you will read, the more you will discuss, the more you will, make efforts. Of course, that will make many more dimensions of the composing a poetry or writing poetry will become clear. Uh, Sometimes we see the climax in the poetry is arrived at by different strategies. Some people use, like here, the intensity of experiences have been used. Play of the language has been there to reach the climax. Sometimes simple lines are quoted, and those are also having capability of reaching or heightening the meaning, rather I should be saying, and then making it very intense. So as I mentioned, the intensity, when whether it is in the short story or it is in the poem or in poetry, when there is a very intense feeling, intense experience on the part of the reader, that is the point of climax, where the crisis is unfolding and it is resolved, or in poetry where there is an eruption and there is either static or a dynamic stage of impressions, impressions that gives rise to meaning. There is a small stanza. The sun is warm, the sky is clear. The sun is warm, the sky is clear. I could lie down like a tired child. I met a traveler from an antique land. Look at the first stanza. The sun is warm, the sky is clear. Nothing is required from outside. It is very clear the sun is warm, the sky is clear. There is progression. The sun is warm because the sky is clear. That means it is a very warm day. It is very enjoyable day. Since it is written by English poet, passionate poet, so this pessimisticness is there. What is pessimisticness? That means it is not very, one should say, activism in the writing. It is a passionate note in it. What then? The sun is warm, the sky is clear. What then? Nothing. So pessimism is there, but the meaning is very clear. There is nothing required to make the meaning more clear or making it more vivid. I could lie down like a tired child. What else is needed there? Nothing. I could lie down like a tired child. There's a completeness in the meaning. The stanza itself is a whole, it's a complete discourse. It's complete in meaning and also able to give the ultimate add ultimate intensity to the meaning. I could lie down like a tired child. That means I am very simple-hearted person who is fed up with the worldly affairs and like to simply take a break. So same is, I met a traveler from an antique land. From an antique land, from far-flung areas, remote area, which is not inhabited by many people, not visited by many people. I just met a traveler. So if we look at these three stanzas, each one is able to sustain on its own and clarify its meaning, giving intensity to the meaning, taking it to the climax. So sometimes such approach is also adopted in the poetry by certain by some poets. Sometimes there is a musical upheaval in the composition, and that adds intensity to it, and it ultimately erupts in the climax. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence stricken multitudes. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red. So you look at it, it has a musicology in it. So looking at it, it is Ode to the West Wind, written by Shelley. So it sounds as if various colors are there in what, in the west winds, which is going to disappear in few moments. So there is a farewell to it. So it is yellow and black and pale. There are three things, and hectic red, as if it is hurrying. So there is a musicology, in the musicology of its rising and diminishing experience. Yellow and black and pale. So pale is diminishing, yellow is rising, black is static, and hectic red means it is heading to a point where it will be taking a recourse of diminishing. So this is another strategy to hectic red means it is likely to be off for some time. So that means the poet is going to lose that particular season, particular weather, particular antiquity of the climate. So these are so many strategies. Those are adopted by the poets to bring about the climax in the poetry. Sometimes there is a lyrical style which is adopted. So a lyrical style is probably one which is also known as a progression pattern. So in progression pattern, there is a progression of meaning, a progression of accumulation of impressions. At the same time, there is a progression in terms of the lyricism. So there is sparking, there is explosion, and the gathering together of the reconcilements. That means the various shades which have been left out during the accumulation of experiences, all those are taken in very sensual manner. So if we look at the Indian music and its compositions, so the lyrics speak a lot about the impressions, whereby those are mixed with music. And one such form of Indian music, which is khayal, khayal is one form of Indian classical music. So there's a very deep and sensual feeling of experiences, old impressions. Those are gathered in a progression pattern, and those are sung by the artist or the singer with the help of music. It is presented, and when the khayal begins with the nostalgic impressions, and when there's a continuity in it, a lot of intervening stages contribute to the impressions. When it becomes most intense, it reaches to the heightened stage, and then there is the climax. So this lyrical style is basically referring to the Indian style of music, gharana, khayal, singing, where it begins from the nostalgic past, reaches the height, uh, passing through different stages, different impressions of the life of the poet who has written the lyrics. So lyrics is basically the contents, the text which is sung by the artist. So because it is also in form of poem, but it has a music in it. It has text with it, that contains the impressions, nostalgia, and the progression patterns in terms of life experiences. So this is also one way to bring about the climax. So this is a very unique and very rare addition to the genre of writing poetry, because it is largely related to music, yet it is one form of climax in the poetry. So, to add a concluding note to our discussion today is that it is very important to give the poem sound beginning. That means there has to be proper pondering over the theme. We discussed how to gather, how to identify the themes. That means we have to think about how the poet speaks to the audience. So he speaks through the personae. Then there is nature and natural and the landscapes. Those are two very important aspects of choosing themes from. Then there is sociological, then romantic. These are basically the grounds. Then there is the development of the theme. That means beginning of the theme, which has to be very clear, which has to deal with the questions of where and why and how. And then there has to be climax. That means the eruption of the unity of impressions during the life experiences. Lot of impressions are gathered. When they reaches the heightened stage, they erupt. Yet it is not very pre-planned, and neither it is pre-planned, nor it is spontaneous, because there is a long process in which the impressions are accumulated. So it is not very spontaneous, yet the way it erupts, it is spontaneous. So that similarly, ending the poem is also another area which has to be very appropriately done. So sometimes there is an ending which gives opportunities to the reader or the listener or the viewer to decide for the meaning. I mean, it is an open ending. Sometimes there is a closed ending or one point ending. Sometimes there is a rounded ending. That means there is a scope for looking and make many visits to exactly reach the meaning. So it is a strategy. Like there is one stanza which perhaps like Robert Frost stopping by wood. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So this is a very important, important example, illustration as to how to end the poem. So here the woods are lovely, dark and deep. So he's talking. You must have read and maybe quite a few times discussed it with your friends and also with your teachers as well. But I have promises to keep. So there's a lot to be done. Uh, just like though it seems very flowery, but yet it is very vast. So at miles to go before I sleep. That means before I breathe last, stop my journey. There is a long distance to cover. That means there's a lot to be done. So this is one such style. There's another example which is instead I sat as if abandoned by my wish, and your hair tumbled down, and clasping your knee you broke hastily into conversation. Now it is very difficult to to bring about a complete meaning. You know, the situation is brought by certain words which have been used by the poet, like uh, like hastily, like clasping, like tumbled hair. So it says in a kind of note that situation will continue. Everything what was to be said has been said, but situation will continue. So though we move into history conversation, but nothing will improve. Did you ever notice the way my gaze failed to make your brief right perpetual? So here one is very uh, critical, about one's own viewpoint about his or her uh, beloved. So there is so this also a kind of note to end the poetry. So this is the last note perhaps of a person, and he is lamenting within his or her heart as to not to be with the other person anymore. So that is again situation which doesn't very clearly give a very definitive meaning. So it is also a kind of open ending, or we may also take it as a rounded ending of a poem. So, dear learners, with this, I will conclude this session, because this afternoon we will be having another session at 2:15 or so. So we will break a little early today, 10-15 minutes, so as to take a little long break, and then we again meet for the second session. So I would like to recapitulate briefly. This is a very important discussion which talks about as to how to begin writing poetry. What are the questions that are to be dealt with in the beginning, and then how to develop the theme, or what we may call thematic development of writing poetry. And then to talk about the various impressions as to how the poem reaches its climax, and obviously the climax comes through different parameters, different forms, and the poetry sometimes can be written keeping one single phenomena in the center, or there can be many phenomena in the center. Uh, so all these will go into the making of a unity of impressions. That means the gathering of experiences during life, during various facets of journey of life. And when all those becomes very intense, then there is a spontaneous eruption. But at the same time, the poetry climax cannot be called spontaneous or very much pre-planned, because poetry is one such genre which has a lot of to think about, to ponder about, and then it becomes intense, and then it erupts. So it is spontaneous, yet it is not very spontaneous. It is not pre-planned, yet it is planned, because you think, you consider, you look for the theme. So there is a contradiction with that. So, and when we come to the last point, that is rounded ending or flat ending. So when the listener is left to decide for the meaning, that is one strategy. And at times there is a very definitive and concluding remarks that closes down the scope for looking for additional meaning. So that is a close ending to a poem. We may discuss this again in some other session if the time permits, but for the uh, time being, I will now close down the session unless there is a question from our learners. If there is any, please come.
Sir, we have not discussed about the size of a poem.
Okay.
How
Right.
long, how short it can be, and are there some parameters laid down or some conventions established for that?
No, there are certain points which we will discuss. Probably, maybe we'll take them in the afternoon session. Definitely, this is a good question. No, actually, you see, uh, uh, there are no such set norms as to how long a poetry should be. Look at the Highland poetry, uh, by Wordsworth. So there are very long poems, but look at Milton, Shelley, and certain other poets, very short poems. Same is with Indian poetry. There are very long poems, there are very short poems. So, one, it depends upon the theme that you have chosen, and second is the treatment. And then there is certain themes are such that they require long treatment. Look at the Saket, you know, very one epic has been written in poetry style. So same is with the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So we will discuss it maybe in another session. But it is a good question, and if the certain parameters are there, we will also put them into discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, RC, we are taking an early break because we will meet again for the second session today. So, thank you very much to be in this session. We hope to meet at probably 2:15 onwards. Thank you very much. Look forward to meeting you in the afternoon session. Thank you.